What if I told you that in 1873, a sitting vice president took railroad stock as payment while casting the deciding Senate vote on their subsidy, and when exposed, simply resigned to become a railroad executive? That congressman in 1921 quietly leased federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for luxury goods and cash-stuffed envelopes, documented in Senate hearings that revealed bribes hidden in little black books? That these aren't conspiracy theories, they're footnotes erased from textbooks. If you're ready to uncover what was buried, hit subscribe. Get comfortable, pour something warm, dim the lights, and settle in. We're walking through the archives of power tonight. Let's start with a moment history prefers you forget. In the spring of 1891, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge stood before Boston's elite at the Union Club, his reputation for principled governance unmarred by scandal. Lodge had spent a decade cultivating an image of intellectual rigor and ethical steadfastness. His speeches on civil service reform filled the congressional record. His name appeared on anti-corruption legislation. His dinner parties attracted the city's most respectable families. The mahogany-paneled rooms where he entertained seemed to radiate institutional trust, each handshake a confirmation of moral authority. But by October of that year, a Senate Ethics Committee hearing would reveal Lodge's private correspondence with railroad executives. Letters that showed him quietly advocating for rate legislation that benefited companies in which he held undisclosed stock. The hearing transcripts, buried in committee archives, documented his careful deflections under questioning. When pressed about a particularly damning letter discussing mutual arrangements, Lodge cited memory lapses and clerical errors. The consequence arrived not as thunderous scandal, but as quiet departure. He resigned his committee chairmanship in December, citing health concerns, and returned to Boston where his social standing remained mysteriously intact. The lamplight in his Beacon Hill study continued to burn late into winter evenings, now illuminating a different kind of work. By the summer of 1923, Chicago Alderman Johnny Powers had transformed the city's 19th ward into what newspapers called a model of efficient governance. Powers sat in City Hall's ornate chambers, his desk positioned near a window overlooking the Chicago River, and approved infrastructure contracts with the measured deliberation of a man deeply concerned with public welfare. His reputation for careful stewardship appeared in editorials praising his commitment to honest dealing in city construction projects. The contracts he signed, for street paving, sewer systems, bridge repairs, carried his bold signature and the city seal. A routine audit in early 1924 uncovered what the city's Department of Finance later described in dry bureaucratic language as accounting irregularities. The audit report, filed in March, documented a pattern. Companies that won contracts under Powers' oversight consistently overbilled by margins of 20 to 35%, with the excess amounts traceable to numbered accounts at 3 downtown banks. One particular invoice for concrete work quoted prices double the market rate. When auditors interviewed the company's bookkeeper, she provided copies of payment ledgers showing cash withdrawals matching the overbilled amounts. Made on the same days Powers deposited identical sums into his personal account. The consequence arrived as settlement rather than prosecution. Powers agreed to reimburse $47,000 to the city treasury, roughly half of what auditors calculated he'd received, and stepped down from the Public Works Committee. No criminal charges were filed. The Chicago Tribune ran a 3-paragraph notice on page 14. Powers retained his alderman's seat and his office overlooking the river, where the lamp on his desk continued to cast its warm glow across contract documents awaiting his signature. In Philadelphia during the prosperous autumn of 1957, First National Bank President Harold Pemberton hosted the annual Children's Hospital fundraising gala at his Rittenhouse Square mansion. The event drew 400 guests and raised $200,000 for pediatric care. Pemberton's photograph appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer the next morning, his hand resting on an oversized charity check, his expression conveying the benevolent authority of a man whose philanthropic commitments matched his financial acumen. For 15 years, he had led First National through careful expansion, his conservative lending practices and personal rectitude becoming part of the bank's institutional identity. His office featured portraits of his predecessors, their stern faces seeming to validate his stewardship. An FBI surveillance memo dated November 1957, declassified decades later, told a different story. Federal agents had been monitoring Pemberton since that summer, following leads about his relationships with Philadelphia organized crime figures. The memo described a series of meetings at a private club on Locust Street, where Pemberton reportedly provided loans to businesses that laundered gambling proceeds, accepting higher interest rates paid in cash. One passage noted, subject observed accepting manila envelope from known associate of Nicodemo Scarfo. Envelope not deposited through normal banking channels. The investigation never produced charges. In January 1958, Pemberton announced his retirement, citing his wife's health and his desire to focus on charitable work. The bank's board issued a statement praising his exemplary tenure and unwavering commitment to Philadelphia's financial stability. He relocated to a waterfront property in Cape May, where neighbors knew him as a quiet philanthropist who funded the local library's expansion. The lamp in his study, visible from the street on winter evenings, illuminated shelves of leather-bound banking journals, their spines aligned with institutional precision. By the fall of 1974, when Watergate hearings consumed Washington, Dwight Chapin had already positioned himself as a peripheral figure, a young aide whose tangential involvement suggested professional competence rather than criminal conspiracy. Chapin testified before the Senate Watergate Committee in October, his Navy suit and precise testimony, projecting the image of a detail-oriented professional caught in circumstances beyond his control. His role organizing President Nixon's scheduling and advance work appeared in hearing transcripts as administrative, rather than strategic. Senators questioned him for 2 hours about his knowledge of the committee to re-elect the president's activities. The testimony revealed what prosecutors later described as deliberate compartmentalization. Chapin acknowledged hiring Donald Segretti to conduct political intelligence operations, but claimed ignorance of the specific activities involved. When shown documents linking him to funding for what became known as dirty tricks campaigns, fabricated letters, false news releases, targeted disruptions of democratic events, Chapin repeatedly testified that he couldn't recall specific conversations or didn't understand the implications of his authorizations. The consequence arrived as calculated mercy. Chapin was convicted of perjury in April 1974, sentenced to 10 months in federal prison, and pardoned by President Ford in 1975. He served 8 months. Upon release, he joined a Chicago public relations firm, his conviction mentioned only briefly in his professional biography. The office he eventually occupied in a Michigan Avenue high-rise featured a photograph of him with President Nixon, the image capturing a moment before the machinery of scandal had fully revealed itself. In the winter of 1889, New York State Assembly Speaker Theodore Roosevelt, not yet the president but already a figure of moral certainty, delivered speeches in the Albany Capitol building denouncing corruption in state government. His voice carried through the assembly chamber with the force of righteous conviction. His calls for civil service reform documented in the Albany Evening Journal. Roosevelt's public image rested on his willingness to challenge Tammany Hall's influence in state affairs, his speeches framed as lonely crusades against entrenched interests. The marble hallways echoed with his pronouncements about governmental virtue. That spring, journalist Lincoln Steffens conducted an investigation from McClure's magazine into Albany's legislative process. His expose, published in July 1889, documented a pattern of what Steffens called selective reformism. While Roosevelt publicly condemned municipal corruption, his assembly voting record showed consistent support for corporate interests, particularly railroads and insurance companies, that operated through the same patronage networks he claimed to oppose. Steffens interviewed 3 assembly members who described Roosevelt's private assurances that his reform rhetoric was for public consumption, while his legislative work protected legitimate business interests. The consequence of this exposure amounted to precisely nothing. No ethics investigation followed. Roosevelt's reputation for reform remained intact, his moral authority actually strengthened by his willingness to condemn the very system in which he functioned. He continued to hold his assembly seat, his evening routine unchanged, working late in his office, while lamplight illuminated papers arranged on his desk with characteristic precision, each document a performance of governmental propriety, a federal judge's probity tested by circumstance. When U.S. District Judge Al C. Hastings presided over criminal trials in Miami's federal courthouse during the late 1990s, his courtroom reflected judicial gravitas, dark wood paneling, the seal of the Southern District of Florida mounted behind the bench, an atmosphere of institutional authority. Hastings had been appointed to the bench in 1979, surviving an impeachment trial in 1989. He was acquitted by the Senate on charges of soliciting a bribe, though he'd been removed from office by the House, and later elected to Congress. By 2001, his congressional office featured certificates documenting his legal career and photographs from his judicial tenure. A routine judicial conduct review in 2001, triggered by constituent complaints, examined Hastings's financial disclosures during his congressional service. The review board's report, filed with the House Ethics Committee in September, noted irregularities in his reporting of gifts and travel expenses. Several entries showed expensive trips paid for by groups with business before committees on which Hastings served, disclosed late or incompletely. One trip to the Caribbean, officially described as educational, coincided with fundraising events for his re-election campaign, with costs covered by pharmaceutical industry representatives. The review resulted in a formal censure, a written reprimand placed in his congressional file. No financial penalties were assessed. No further investigation was conducted. Hastings issued a statement acknowledging administrative oversights in his disclosure filings and promising renewed attention to paperwork requirements. He retained his congressional seat, his office unchanged. The lamplight from his Capitol Hill workspace, visible in evening photographs of the building's corridors, illuminating the ongoing business of governance. In the autumn of 1935, Louisiana Governor Huey Long positioned himself as a champion of populist reform, his Share Our Wealth program articulated in speeches that filled the state capitol building in Baton Rouge. Long's rhetoric attacked concentrated wealth and institutional corruption, his voice carrying through crowds gathered on the Capitol steps. His public image, carefully cultivated through radio addresses and newspaper profiles, presented him as a crusader against the very power structures that had dominated Louisiana politics for generations. The brass fixtures in his office gleamed under electric light, symbols of a government supposedly transformed by democratic accountability. That same autumn, a New Orleans grand jury convened to investigate allegations that Long operated what the Times-Picayune called a sophisticated patronage machine. The proceedings, documented in grand jury transcripts released decades later, examined testimony from 37 witnesses describing a system in which state contracts, judgeships, and administrative appointments functioned as currency in a carefully managed political economy. One highway contractor testified that his company received $2.3 million in state contracts after contributing $50,000 to Long's political organization, a transaction documented in both company ledgers and bank records. The grand jury proceedings concluded in December with no indictments. The presiding judge, a Long appointee, accepted the prosecution's argument that while the testimony suggested concerning patterns, it didn't meet the threshold for criminal conspiracy charges. Long continued as governor, his reform agenda apparently undiminished by the investigation. When he was assassinated in September 1935, before the jury's final report was published, the lamp in his Capitol office was extinguished for the final time, its glow having illuminated a contradiction that Louisiana voters had chosen to accept. By the spring of 1983, Representative Dan Crane served as a member of the House Ethics Committee, his position a reflection of his reputation for moral clarity. Crane, representing Illinois' 19th Congressional District, had built his political identity on family values advocacy and government accountability. His congressional office featured photographs of his 6 children and plaques commemorating his work on ethics reform legislation. The desk where he reviewed ethics complaints sat positioned to catch afternoon light through windows, overlooking the Capitol grounds, creating an atmosphere of judicial deliberation. In July 1983, a House investigation, conducted by the very committee on which Crane served, examined allegations that he had engaged in a sexual relationship with a teenage congressional page. The investigation's findings, documented in a report released that summer, confirmed the relationship and included testimony from the page describing encounters in Crane's congressional office. The report noted that Crane initially denied the allegations before acknowledging them when confronted with corroborating evidence. The consequence arrived as public humiliation rather than criminal prosecution. The House voted 4-1-3 to censure Crane, requiring him to stand in the well of the House chamber while the Speaker read the resolution of reprimand. No criminal charges were filed. The page was 17 at the time. Above the age of consent in Washington, D.C., Crane apologized publicly, citing personal failings and family crisis. He lost his re-election bid in 1984, departing Congress in January 1985. The lamp on his office desk, packed away with his files and photographs, had illuminated documents about governmental ethics while concealing private conduct that contradicted every principle he'd claimed to uphold. In the autumn of 1902, New York's Tammany Hall leader George Washington Plunkett hosted his annual Thanksgiving distribution of food baskets to families in his West Side district. The New York Herald documented the event with photographs showing Plunkett personally handing turkeys to grateful constituents, his expression conveying benevolent authority. For 2 decades, Plunkett had cultivated a reputation as a political operative who understood that power required public generosity. His charitable work appeared regularly in society columns. His donations to churches and settlement houses presented as evidence of civic commitment. The office from which he coordinated these distributions featured a mahogany desk positioned near a window overlooking the Hudson River, the lamplight creating shadows that suggested both industry and institutional permanence. A multi-part investigation by muckraking journalist William Riordan, published in the New York Evening Post in early 1903, examined the financial architecture behind Plunkett's philanthropy. Riordan's reporting documented what Plunkett himself openly called honest graft, using advanced knowledge of city planning decisions to purchase land in areas slated for development, then selling it to the city at substantial profit when the projects proceeded. One transaction involved property on the Upper West Side, purchased for $30,000 in 1898, and sold to the city for $180,000 in 1901 for a school construction site, with Plunkett serving on the committee that approved both the school's location and the land purchase. The investigation produced electoral validation rather than scandal. Plunkett not only retained his district leadership position, but expanded Tammany's influence in the 1903 municipal elections, with his candidates winning by larger margins than in previous cycles. Voters, it seemed, appreciated the transactional clarity. Plunkett delivered services, secured jobs, and provided charity, financing these activities through arrangements that enriched him while technically operating within legal boundaries. The lamp in his Tammany office continued to burn late into evenings, illuminating ledgers that tracked both charitable distributions and real estate acquisitions with equal precision. Cabinet credentials built on diplomatic success. When Dean Rusk assumed the position of Secretary of State in January 1961, his appointment was hailed as a triumph of meritocratic selection. Rusk's background, Rhodes Scholar, State Department veteran, Foundation president, appeared in newspaper profiles as evidence of the Kennedy administration's commitment to intellectual competence over political patronage. His office in the State Department building featured leather-bound volumes of diplomatic history, their spines suggesting institutional continuity. The desk where he reviewed classified cables occupied space beneath portraits of his predecessors, creating visual testimony to governmental tradition. A leaked State Department memo from November 1963, obtained by investigative journalist I.F. Stone and published in his weekly newsletter, revealed tensions between Rusk's public assurances and his private communications about Vietnam policy. While Rusk testified before Congress in October 1963 that American military advisors in South Vietnam were making significant progress in supporting the Diem government, the leaked memo showed his internal assessment was far more pessimistic. In a cable to the U.S. ambassador in Saigon, Rusk acknowledged that current strategy shows no likelihood of success, and that public statements must continue to project confidence regardless of field realities. The consequence of this revelation enhanced rather than damaged Rusk's career. The memo demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the gap between diplomatic messaging and operational reality, a skill valued in foreign policy circles. Rusk continued as Secretary of State through both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, serving until January 1969. The lamp in his State Department office illuminated cables and briefing documents that continued the tradition of maintaining public confidence while privately acknowledging difficult truths, a practice so normalized it barely registered as contradiction. A reformer whose municipal record seemed spotless. In San Francisco's contentious 1877 mayoral race, Isaac Kalloch ran on a reform platform explicitly targeting municipal corruption. Kalloch, a Baptist minister turned politician, delivered speeches from the steps of City Hall denouncing the unholy alliance between city officials and railroad interests. His campaign literature, preserved in the San Francisco History Center archives, promised to restore honest governance and end the plague of bribery that infects our civic institutions. The moral authority he projected rested partly on his religious credentials and partly on his outsider status, a man untainted by existing power structures. His campaign office featured a simple desk lit by kerosene lamp, a deliberate contrast to the ornate furnishings of establishment politicians. Within months of Kalloch's November 1877 electoral victory, a municipal records audit, requested by opposing supervisors suspicious of his reform promises, uncovered irregularities in city construction contracts awarded during his first 6 months in office. The audit, filed with the Board of Supervisors in May 1878, documented that companies owned by Kalloch's brother-in-law and 2 campaign contributors had received contracts worth $340,000 for street improvements, awarded without competitive bidding. The contracts specified prices approximately 40% above market rates, documented in comparative bids from the previous administration. The political consequence reinforced rather than undermined Kalloch's position. When confronted with the audit findings, he framed the contracts as necessary corrections to years of favoritism toward establishment firms, arguing that his administration was diversifying city business relationships. San Francisco voters, many of whom had supported his campaign precisely because it promised to disrupt existing arrangements, accepted this explanation. Kalloch won re-election in 1879 by a wider margin than his initial victory. The kerosene lamp in his office gave way to electric lighting, a symbol of modernity that illuminated the same transactional governance practices he had once condemned. When President Reagan nominated Robert Bork to the Supreme Court in July 1987, Bork's credentials appeared formidable. Yale Law School professor, Solicitor General, federal appellate judge. His nomination hearings, conducted in the Senate caucus room throughout September, were televised nationally. Bork testified with academic precision about constitutional interpretation, his scholarly demeanor suggesting judicial temperament. The room's ornate fixtures and marble columns provided a setting that emphasized institutional gravity. Senators questioned him for over 30 hours across 12 days of hearings. The hearings revealed contradictions between Bork's public scholarly writings and his private conduct during the Watergate crisis. Civil rights advocates and legal scholars testified about Bork's role as acting attorney general in October 1973, when he carried out President Nixon's order to fire Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox after both Attorney General Elliot Richardson and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus resigned rather than execute the order. While Bork later characterized his decision as necessary to prevent constitutional crisis, documents introduced during the hearings showed he had participated in planning the dismissal before Richardson and Ruckelshaus made their resignations known, suggesting coordination rather than reluctant duty. The Senate rejected Bork's nomination in October 1987 by a vote of 58-42, the widest margin of defeat for a Supreme Court nominee in half a century. But the consequence for Bork personally proved minimal. He returned to his appellate judgeship, later resigned to join a prestigious law firm and became a well-compensated conservative commentator and scholar. The lamp in his chambers at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals continued to illuminate his legal opinions until his resignation in 1988, his career trajectory affected but hardly destroyed by the Senate's verdict. In the summer of 1898, General Arthur MacArthur commanded U.S. forces in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War and subsequent Philippine-American War. MacArthur's military reputation, documented in War Department dispatches and newspaper accounts, rested on his tactical success in securing Manila and his purported commitment to civilizing the Filipino population through American military governance. His headquarters in Manila featured maps and campaign plans arranged on tables beneath hanging lamps, creating an atmosphere of strategic professionalism. Official reports described his administration as firm but fair, emphasizing his efforts to establish civilian infrastructure and maintain order. An Army inquiry conducted in 1902, prompted by reports from junior officers and civilian observers, examined MacArthur's counterinsurgency tactics during the period 1899-1901. The inquiry report, filed with the War Department in March 1902 and partially declassified in later decades, documented the use of what MacArthur termed necessary severity, including village burnings, forced relocations, and the implementation of reconcentration policies that resulted in civilian casualties from disease and starvation. One section of the report quoted a cable MacArthur sent to field commanders authorizing all measures deemed appropriate to pacify hostile populations, language that subordinate officers interpreted as permission for harsh tactics. The inquiry produced a Medal of Honor for MacArthur, awarded in 1902 for his service in the Philippines. The medal citation made no mention of the inquiry's findings, focusing instead on his distinguished conduct and action and his role in securing American control of the archipelago. MacArthur continued his military career, eventually becoming the Army's highest-ranking officer. The lamp in his quarters at military posts from Manila to Washington illuminated a career that transformed controversial colonial administration into official military honor, the gap between public recognition and documented conduct widening with each promotion. As the stock market crashed in October 1929, Undersecretary of the Treasury Ogden Mills projected calm institutional authority in his testimony before Congress and his statements to the press. Mills, who had served in various Treasury positions since 1927, appeared in photographs seated at his mahogany desk in the Treasury building, surrounded by financial reports and ledgers that suggested mastery of economic complexity. His public statements, quoted in the New York Times throughout late 1929 and early 1930, consistently emphasized that the economy's fundamentals remain sound, and that the crash represented temporary market adjustment rather than systemic crisis. Mills testified before the Senate Finance Committee in December 1929, his appearance documented in congressional records that reveal a striking gap between his public optimism and his private communications. While he assured senators that Treasury projections showed economic recovery beginning by spring 1930, internal Treasury memos from the same period, obtained decades later by economic historians, showed Mills warning President Hoover that current indicators suggest prolonged contraction and recommending preparation for extended unemployment and potential banking failures. The consequence enhanced rather than damaged Mills's career. His public confidence was interpreted as steadying leadership during crisis, and President Hoover appointed him Treasury Secretary in February 1932, a position he held until the Roosevelt administration took office. The lamp in his Treasury office illuminated economic reports whose dire projections never made their way into his public testimony. The gap between private knowledge and public performance normalized as governmental responsibility rather than recognized as institutional dishonesty. In Boston during 1948, Massachusetts Attorney General Clarence Barnes built his reputation prosecuting municipal corruption in smaller Massachusetts cities. Barnes's task force investigations, documented in state attorney general reports filed throughout 1948 and 1949, targeted city councilors and contractors in working-class communities like Fall River and Brockton, producing indictments for bribery, contract fraud, and kickback schemes. His press conferences, covered extensively by Boston newspapers, emphasized his commitment to rooting out corruption wherever it hides. The office where he coordinated these investigations featured file cabinets stuffed with case documents, the overhead lamp casting dramatic shadows across evidence photographs spread on tables. A corruption task force report filed with the state legislature in November 1949 revealed an interesting pattern in Barnes's prosecutorial choices. While his investigations aggressively pursued Democratic city officials in working-class communities, they notably avoided examining similar contract practices in Republican-controlled suburbs where the same types of arrangements operated. The report, compiled by Democratic legislators suspicious of Barnes's political motives, documented comparable bid rigging and favoritism patterns in suburban communities that had not triggered attorney general investigations. When questioned about this disparity, Barnes cited resource constraints and credible complaint thresholds. The political consequence validated Barnes's strategy. His selective enforcement generated positive press coverage, focused on his corruption-fighting credentials while avoiding powerful suburban interests. He won the Massachusetts governorship in 1950, his prosecution record cited as evidence of governmental integrity. The lamp in his state house office as governor continued to illuminate the same strategic calculations, targeting corruption selectively rather than systematically, a practice so common it barely registered as partisan manipulation. When Jimmy Carter ran for president in 1976, his campaign explicitly positioned him as an outsider untainted by Washington's ethical compromises. Carter's rhetoric, documented in campaign speeches and debate transcripts, emphasized his commitment to transparency and his distance from the Watergate-era corruption that had dominated recent politics. His campaign literature promised a government as good as its people, framing his Georgia governorship as proof that integrity could survive political success. The Atlanta hotel suite that served as his campaign headquarters featured simple furnishings and fluorescent lighting, a deliberate aesthetic choice meant to signal populist accessibility. Federal Election Commission filings from the 1976 campaign, reviewed during routine post-election audits, revealed discrepancies between Carter's public emphasis on grassroots fundraising and the actual sources of his campaign financing. The FEC documentation showed that approximately 65% of his campaign funds came from donations exceeding $1,000, with significant contributions from Georgia business interests and national corporate donors. Several contributions came from individuals and companies with business before the Georgia state government during Carter's governorship, including utilities and construction firms that had received favorable regulatory treatment. Carter lost the 1976 election to Gerald Ford, though not because of campaign finance questions, which received minimal press coverage during the race. The consequence of the FEC findings amounted to routine bureaucratic noting. The discrepancies were acknowledged, explained as standard campaign finance practices, and filed away. The gap between Carter's outsider rhetoric and his conventional fundraising methods exemplified a pattern so normalized it barely qualified as contradiction. The lamp in his campaign office, dismantled after the election, had illuminated both high-minded speeches about governmental integrity and donor lists indistinguishable from those of the establishment politicians he claimed to oppose. In New York City, during the autumn of 1919, Comptroller Charles Craig supervised municipal finances from an office in City Hall, where leather-bound ledgers lined the walls beneath gaslights converted to electric fixtures. Craig's reputation for fiscal precision appeared in newspaper profiles that praised his exacting standards and meticulous oversight of city expenditures. His desk, positioned to face the door, created a visual impression of transparent accessibility. Anyone could walk in and witness the machinery of municipal accounting at work. For 7 years, he had managed the city's books, his tenure marked by annual budgets that balanced to the penny and audit reports that rarely found discrepancies. A routine audit conducted by state examiners in early 1920, filed with the New York State Comptroller's Office in March, revealed patterns in Craig's record-keeping that suggested something other than the precision for which he was known. The audit findings documented approximately $2.3 million in city funds transferred to accounts designated as miscellaneous operational reserves, a category that existed in the city charter but had rarely been used in such volumes. The examiner's report noted that Craig had authorization to make such transfers under emergency provisions, but that many of the transfers occurred during periods when no specific emergency had been declared or documented. When state investigators traced the reserve accounts, they discovered that the funds had been subsequently transferred to banks controlled by Tammany Hall-affiliated financial institutions, where they generated interest payments that were not credited back to city accounts. One examiner's memo, preserved in state archives, noted, "The comptroller has created a system whereby city funds enrich private institutions while technically remaining under municipal control. The legal structure is complex enough to frustrate immediate prosecution. The consequence arrived as bureaucratic reshuffling." Craig was transferred from the comptroller's position to a newly created role as special financial advisor to the mayor, with an equivalent salary and an office in the same city hall building. No criminal charges were filed. The transfer was announced as a reorganization of fiscal oversight responsibilities necessitated by the city's growing complexity. Craig served in this advisory role for 3 more years before retiring with full pension. The lamp in his new office illuminated memoranda offering financial advice to city departments, its steady glow suggesting that the machinery of governance had simply reconfigured itself around his particular expertise in exploiting technical loopholes. By 1954, Otto Kerner Jr. served as U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, his Chicago office a launching pad for what newspapers called an aggressive campaign against organized crime. Kerner's trial record, documented in federal court filings from 1950 through 1954, showed successful prosecutions of gambling operations, labor union corruption, and interstate theft rings. His courtroom presence, described in Chicago Tribune accounts as commanding but fair, projected exactly the combination of toughness and integrity that built political reputations. The federal building office where he prepared cases featured law books stacked on tables beneath fluorescent lights, creating an atmosphere of prosecutorial diligence. Trial records from Kerner's tenure reveal an interesting prosecutorial pattern. While his office successfully convicted dozens of street-level operatives and mid-tier organized crime figures, investigations that might have reached into connections with prominent Chicago business leaders or political figures consistently stalled before indictments were filed. A review conducted years later by the Justice Department's Internal Affairs Division, examining case files after Kerner's own corruption conviction in 1973, found multiple instances where promising investigations were closed or redirected during his tenure as U.S. Attorney. One closed case file contained a memo stating, "Insufficient evidence to proceed, despite witness cooperation and documentary support, referring to an investigation into racetrack stock manipulation involving Illinois state officials." The consequence of Kerner's selective prosecution enhanced his political trajectory. In 1960, he was elected governor of Illinois, his record as U.S. Attorney cited as proof of his commitment to law enforcement. In 1968, he was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. The irony emerged only in 1973, when Kerner himself was convicted of bribery, conspiracy, perjury, and related charges for accepting racetrack stock in exchange for favorable racing dates during his governorship, essentially engaging in the same type of corruption his U.S. Attorney's office had declined to prosecute a decade earlier. The lamp in his judicial chambers, extinguished after his conviction, had illuminated legal opinions while concealing a career built on strategically limited enforcement. When Philip Habib served as U.S. ambassador to Lebanon in 1981, his cables to the State Department projected the careful, analytical distance expected of professional diplomats. Habib's reports, archived in State Department records, assessed Lebanon's civil war and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts with measured language that acknowledged complexity while avoiding definitive predictions. His embassy office in Beirut featured secure communication equipment and reference materials on Middle Eastern history, the physical apparatus of institutional expertise. Photographs from the period show him meeting with Lebanese officials, his expression conveying diplomatic seriousness. The State Department Cable Archive, partially declassified in subsequent years, revealed tensions between Habib's official reporting and his private assessments. While his formal cables to Washington emphasized possibilities for negotiated settlements and characterized various factions as potential partners for peace, his back-channel communications to senior State Department officials painted a far more pessimistic picture. One cable from August 1981, marked for limited distribution, stated, "Current diplomatic framework assumes rationality and shared interests that do not exist. Public optimism required for political management, but operational planning should assume extended conflict and potential regional destabilization." The consequence enhanced Habib's reputation as a skilled diplomat who understood the gap between public diplomacy and private strategic thinking. He was reassigned to special envoy positions handling sensitive negotiations. His ability to maintain optimistic public rhetoric while privately acknowledging difficult realities, valued as sophisticated statecraft rather than dishonesty. The lamp in his subsequent State Department offices illuminated briefing documents that continued this tradition. Official optimism layered over private pessimism. The gap between public and private assessment normalized as diplomatic professionalism. In 1996, Democratic National Committee Finance Chairman Charles Try coordinated fundraising from his Washington office, a suite in a building near Capitol Hill where bundled contribution checks were sorted and processed under the glow of overhead fluorescent lights. Try's operation, documented in DNC financial records, brought in millions of dollars during the 1996 presidential campaign, with contributions flowing from individuals and organizations connected to Asian business interests. His fundraising prowess earned him access to White House events and recognition as a key figure in Democratic campaign operations. A Senate Government Affairs Committee hearing in 1997, conducted to investigate campaign finance irregularities from the 1996 election, revealed problematic patterns in Try's fundraising methods. The hearing testimony, preserved in congressional records, documented that many contributions came from individuals with limited financial means, who appeared to be serving as conduits for foreign money. One sequence of transactions showed 16 contributions of $1,000 each, all from individuals sharing the same Los Angeles address, a small apartment, and all deposited on the same day. Bank records introduced during the hearing showed that many of these contributors received wire transfers from Hong Kong accounts shortly before making their donations. The investigation concluded with Try's resignation from the DNC in January 1997, before the committee issued its final report. He eventually pleaded guilty to federal charges of violating campaign finance laws and was sentenced to probation and community service. But the systemic consequences remained minimal. The DINC returned some questionable contributions, issued statements about tightening oversight procedures, and continued fundraising operations with minor adjustments. The lamp in Try's former office was extinguished, but the basic architecture of bundled contributions and the difficulty of tracking ultimate sources remained intact. The machinery of campaign finance adapted rather than reformed. Baltimore City Commissioner William Preston oversaw public safety operations from 1906 through 1910, a period when the city's police and fire departments faced scrutiny over response effectiveness and allegations of selective enforcement. Preston's office in Baltimore City Hall featured maps of the city's districts and rosters of personnel assignments, illuminated by desk lamps that cast shadows across administrative paperwork. His public statements, documented in Baltimore Sun coverage, emphasized his commitment to professional standards and efficient operations. The department's official reports showed declining crime statistics and improved emergency response times, data that supported Preston's claims of organizational improvement. A city investigation conducted in 1910, initiated by reform-minded city council members, examined Preston's tenure in detail. The investigation's findings, filed with the city council in September 1910, documented patterns that contradicted the official statistics. Testimony from beat officers described pressure to underreport certain crimes in affluent districts while maintaining aggressive enforcement in working-class neighborhoods. Fire department personnel testified about delayed responses to fires in areas where property owners had disputes with the Preston administration. The investigation report included one fire captain's statement: "We received instructions to stage equipment near certain properties before we had official notice of fire calls, suggesting advanced coordination with property owners seeking insurance claims." The investigation's consequence demonstrated the gap between evidence and accountability. The city council vote on whether to remove Preston ended in a tie, with the mayor declining to cast a deciding vote. Preston completed his term and retired in 1911 with full pension and a testimonial dinner attended by prominent business leaders. The Baltimore Sun's coverage of his retirement mentioned the investigation only in passing, describing it as controversial charges that were never definitively proven. The lamp in his City Hall office passed to his successor, who inherited the same administrative structures and many of the same personnel, ensuring continuity of practices, if not of individual leadership. When Edward Kennedy assumed the position of Senate Majority Whip in 1969, his office in the Capitol building served as a coordination point for Democratic legislative strategy. Kennedy's reputation, despite the Chappaquiddick incident earlier that year, remained sufficient to secure his leadership position, a testament to both his family's political legacy and the Senate's institutional tolerance for personal scandal when separated from legislative competence. The office where he worked featured bookcases filled with Massachusetts history and family photographs, the visible symbols of dynastic political authority. His desk lamp illuminated legislative drafts and vote-counting sheets that tracked the Democratic caucus's positions. A Senate Ethics Committee probe in 1969, initiated in response to constituent complaints about Kennedy's conduct following the Chappaquiddick incident, examined whether his actions warranted formal censure or other sanctions. The probe's scope, documented in committee records, remained carefully limited. It focused on Kennedy's delay in reporting the accident and questions about his testimony, avoiding broader investigation into potential obstruction or the adequacy of the local investigation. The committee interviewed Kennedy privately, reviewed police reports and court records, and received testimony from Massachusetts officials. The probe concluded without formal action. The Ethics Committee issued no public report, instead releasing a brief statement that the matter involved state legal issues outside the committee's jurisdiction and that Kennedy's sworn testimony to Massachusetts authorities, whatever its accuracy, did not constitute a Senate ethics violation. Kennedy retained his whip position and his committee assignments. The consequence was political rather than institutional. He chose not to run for president in 1972, a decision influenced by recognition that Chappaquiddick would feature prominently in any national campaign. But within the Senate, the lamp in his office continued to burn during late-night legislative sessions. His leadership authority intact, the institution having absorbed personal scandal without structural consequence. In Philadelphia during 1932, School Superintendent Edward Stanton promoted administrative reforms intended to modernize the city's educational system. Stanton's office in the district headquarters featured organizational charts and efficiency studies, their pages spread across tables beneath overhead lights that suggested bureaucratic rationality. His reform proposals, presented to the school board in public meetings documented by the Philadelphia Inquirer, emphasized centralized purchasing, standardized curricula, and merit-based hiring, language that projected progressive-era faith in scientific management. A grand jury investigation convened in late 1932, prompted by a whistleblower complaint from a district purchasing officer, examined the actual implementation of Stanton's reforms. The grand jury testimony, preserved in Philadelphia County records, revealed that centralized purchasing had created opportunities for favoritism rather than eliminated them. Stanton had steered contracts to a narrow group of vendors, including companies owned by his brother-in-law and two former business associates, by writing contract specifications that only these vendors could meet. One textbook contract required books printed on specific paper stock available from only one supplier, who charged 30% more than comparable alternatives. Stanton testified before the grand jury in January 1933, acknowledging the vendor relationships, but characterizing them as coincidental rather than corrupt. He argued that the specifications reflected educational quality standards, not favoritism, and that vendor relationships predated his appointment. The grand jury declined to indict, citing insufficient evidence of explicit quid pro quo arrangements. Stanton announced his retirement in March 1933, citing health reasons and his desire to return to private sector education work. The Philadelphia School Board issued a statement praising his modernization efforts and commitment to educational excellence. The lamp in his former office illuminated the work of his successor, who inherited a purchasing system that technically complied with reform principles while maintaining the same network of favored vendors. When Lewis Libby served as chief of staff to Vice President Dick Cheney in 2005, his West Wing office functioned as a coordination center for the administration's foreign policy messaging. Libby's position gave him access to classified intelligence, communication with journalists, and influence over how the administration framed its rationale for the Iraq War. The office where he worked featured secure communication systems and classified briefing materials, the physical infrastructure of national security decision-making. His public role involved coordinating statements, preparing the vice president for interviews, and managing relationships with reporters who covered defense and intelligence issues. A special counsel investigation led by Patrick Fitzgerald in 2005 examined whether Libby had leaked the identity of CIA officer Valerie Plame to journalists in retaliation for her husband's criticism of administration Iraq war claims. The investigation, documented in court filings and testimony transcripts, revealed that Libby had discussed Plame's CIA employment with multiple journalists while publicly denying having done so. Grand jury testimony showed Libby had learned about Plame from Vice President Cheney, discussed her with reporters including Judith Miller of the New York Times and Matthew Cooper of Time magazine, and then told FBI investigators and the grand jury that he had first learned about her from journalists, a chronology contradicted by documented evidence. Libby was convicted in March 2007 of obstruction of justice, perjury, and making false statements to federal investigators. He was sentenced to 30 months in prison and fined $250,000. But the consequence remained limited by institutional protection. President Bush commuted Libby's prison sentence in July 2007, and President Trump pardoned him completely in 2018. Libby never served prison time. He returned to legal practice and consulting, his career affected but not destroyed, his conviction ultimately erased from his record. The lamp that had illuminated classified documents in his West Wing office was extinguished, but the pattern it represented? Senior officials who cooperated with investigations while managing their legal exposure through selective testimony, ultimately protected by executive clemency, remained a feature of how power shields its own. Manila, Philippines. March 1998, Finance Undersecretary Rodrigo Velasco met with representatives from the Asian Development Bank in a private dining room at the Manila Hotel. According to internal ADB memos declassified in 2019, Velasco presented a restructuring proposal that differed substantially from what his department had submitted to Congress 3 weeks earlier. The meeting resulted in a $400 million loan modification that shifted infrastructure priorities toward projects in Velasco's home province. When confronted about the discrepancy in 2003, Velasco cited standard negotiating flexibility. New York City, November 1876, Tammany Hall District Leader William Boss Tweed received visitors in a back office at the New York County Courthouse while officially under indictment for fraud. Court records from his subsequent trial revealed that during this period, Tweed continued to approve city contracts through intermediaries. A ledger recovered from his associate Peter Sweeney's estate showed payments totaling $87,000 to judges, aldermen, and newspaper editors between his arrest and conviction. The courthouse where these meetings occurred had itself been built at 3 times its estimated cost, with the excess funneled through Tweed's network. Washington, D.C. July 1954, Senator Joseph McCarthy held what his appointment calendar listed as constituent meetings in room 357 of the Senate Office Building during the Army McCarthy hearings. Testimony from McCarthy aide Roy Cohn, given decades later, revealed these sessions involved coordination with Pentagon officials seeking to discredit specific Army officers. Transcripts from one meeting, discovered in Cohn's papers in 1986, show McCarthy receiving classified personnel files that would appear in his public accusations within days. The room's official visitor logs for this period were later reported as lost in routine archival transfer. Chicago, February 1924. Cook County Commissioner Anthony DeAndrea conducted city zoning board business from a table at the Bella Napoli Cafe in Little Italy. According to FBI surveillance reports compiled during the Prohibition era, DeAndrea approved building permits and variances during these lunch consultations, while legitimate petitioners waited in county offices. Building contractor testimony in a 1927 grand jury investigation revealed that permits processed at the CAF typically required cash payments of $500 to $2,000, compared to the standard $50 filing fee. DeAndrea was assassinated in May 1921, before the investigation concluded, and the CAF's owner claimed all relevant records had been destroyed in a kitchen fire. London, October 1991. Robert Maxwell, media proprietor and member of Parliament, hosted evening gatherings at his Holborn offices that his scheduler described as informal policy discussions. Documents recovered after Maxwell's death in November 1991 showed these meetings included executives from companies bidding on government printing contracts that Maxwell's parliamentary committee would evaluate. Minutes from one October session, found aboard Maxwell's yacht Lady Ghislaine, detailed a $12 million contract allocation that was announced publicly 3 weeks later. Investigators discovered that Maxwell had borrowed against his pension funds to provide bridge financing for the winning bidder, creating a complex web of mutual obligation. Boston, August 1893. Massachusetts Railroad Commissioner Thomas Quincy Jr. maintained what he termed a working office at the Parker House Hotel, separate from his official State House chambers. Letters discovered in the Boston and Maine Railroad Archive in 1947 reference multiple meetings between Quincy and railroad executives at the usual location, while safety violation hearings were pending. Hotel billing records showed the B&M Railroad covered Quincy's suite rental from 1891-1894. When questioned about potential conflicts during his 1895 reconfirmation hearing, Quincy stated the arrangement was a practical convenience that allowed him to work longer hours. Berlin, June 1978. East German Planning Ministry official Klaus Hartmann utilized a private apartment in the Pankow district for what Stasi files later classified as economic coordination meetings. Records released after reunification show Hartmann approved export licenses and hard currency allocations during these sessions, which included representatives from state enterprises and officials from the Foreign Trade Ministry. A 1982 Stasi report noted that attendees at Hartmann's apartment received favorable consideration on 89% of their requests, compared to a 34% approval rate for applications processed through standard channels. Hartmann's ministry personnel file contains a 1979 commendation for efficient administration. Jakarta, Indonesia, September 2002. During President Megawati Sukarno-Putri's administration, Minister of Energy Purnomo Yustiantoro conducted contract negotiations at his private residence in Menteng, rather than ministry offices. Later testimony in corruption trials revealed that at least 7 petroleum service contracts worth $2.3 billion were finalized at these sessions. Corporate representatives told investigators that ministry staff would informally indicate that House meetings offered more flexible terms than formal ministry negotiations. Yustiantoro's spokesman characterized the practice as culturally appropriate hospitality and noted that all contracts were eventually filed with proper government agencies. Washington, D.C., October 2008. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson testified before the Senate Banking Committee about the need for financial institution oversight reform, emphasizing transparency and accountability in all government interactions with the financial sector. That same evening, according to Andrew Ross Sorkin's reporting in Too Big to Fail, Paulson held a conference call with Goldman Sachs CEO Lloyd Blankfein and other executives to discuss TARP fund distribution priorities. Notes from the call, later obtained through FOIA requests, showed Paulson advising which applications would receive favorable initial review. Goldman Sachs received $10 billion in TARP funds, approved within 6 days of application, while smaller regional banks waited weeks for responses on much smaller requests. Paris, June 1884. Prime Minister Jules Ferry delivered a speech to the Chamber of Deputies defending France's colonial expansion in Indochina as a civilizing mission undertaken without consideration of commercial advantage. Ferry's private correspondence, later published in historian Jean-Marie Mayer's analysis, reveals that 2 days before the speech, Ferry met with representatives of the Société de Messageries Maritimes, which held monopoly shipping rights to French Indochina. The meeting minutes, preserved in company archives, show Ferry promising that naval deployments would secure harbor facilities advantageous to French commercial interests. The Messageries Maritime stock price rose 23% in the month following Ferry's speech. Washington, D.C., April 1967. During a press conference, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara stated that decisions regarding Vietnam War troop deployments were based solely on military necessity and strategic requirements. The Pentagon Papers, released in 1971, contained a memo McNamara had written 3 days before that press conference, noting that troop increases were timed to demonstrate resolve before the 1968 election cycle and to maintain congressional appropriation levels for defense contractors. The memo specifically referenced the need to sustain production schedules at Lockheed and General Dynamics, both facing potential layoffs. McNamara's public statements made no reference to electoral or economic considerations. New York City, March 1912. Tammany Hall leader Charles Francis Murphy publicly supported Mayor William Gaynor's call for civil service reform, telling reporters that merit and qualification must be our only standards. Historian Terry Galway's research on Tammany reveals that Murphy simultaneously maintained what he called the Sunday roster, a list of city positions that would remain exempt from civil service rules due to emergency operational needs. Documents in the New York Municipal Archives show that positions on this roster increased from 1,200 to 4,700 between 1910 and 1914. The roster was never published or submitted to the Civil Service Commission, though Murphy referenced it in private correspondence with district leaders, advising them on patronage distribution. London, November 1995. During Prime Minister John Major's government, the Department of Trade and Industry Secretary Ian Lang announced strict ethical guidelines for ministers involved in privatization decisions, stating that public confidence requires absolute separation between government roles. And private interests. Documents released under the 30-year rule in 2025 revealed that Lang had attended at least 6 private dinners with executives from National Power and PowerGen while overseeing electricity privatization. His appointment diary, marked personal engagements, showed these meetings occurring within 2 weeks before major policy announcements affecting both companies. Lang later joined the board of PowerGen's subsidiary in 2001. Philadelphia, September 1881. Pennsylvania State Senator Matthew Quay delivered an address at Independence Hall supporting legislation to protect workers from the excesses of industrial combination. Quay proclaimed that no senator should profit from the laws he enacts. Archives at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania contain Quay's personal financial records, showing that during this same period, he held stock in the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Reading Company, both of which benefited from amendments Quay had inserted into mine safety legislation. The amendments shifted inspection costs to the state rather than railroad companies. Quay's holdings in both companies increased substantially in the 6 months following the legislation's passage. Moscow, February 1999. President Boris Yeltsin addressed the Duma emphasizing his commitment to free market principles without favoritism or special dealing. Transcripts released in journalist David Hoffman's The Oligarchs show that 5 days earlier, Yeltsin met privately with Boris Berezovsky and other oligarchs at a government dacha outside Moscow. According to participants' later accounts, This meeting established which state assets would be included in upcoming privatization auctions and which bidders would face reduced regulatory scrutiny. Berezovsky's Logovaz conglomerate subsequently acquired television stations and oil assets at prices substantially below independent valuations. Yeltsin's public statements never acknowledged these private consultations. Chicago, August 1927, Mayor William Big Bill Thompson announced a campaign to clean up City Hall and remove crooked politicians who betray the public trust. Thompson's announcement came during his re-election campaign. Files discovered during the 1931 investigation of Thompson's corporation counsel Samuel Edelson showed that Thompson maintained a private fund supplied by utility companies and construction firms seeking city contracts. Bank records revealed deposits totaling $450,000 to Thompson's political education fund between 1923 and 1927. The fund's existence was known to Thompson's inner circle, but was never mentioned in his public reform rhetoric. Thompson's reform campaign helped him win re-election by 83,000 votes. Manila, Philippines, August 1945. During the transition from Japanese occupation to Philippine independence, documentation for the Commonwealth Treasury Department's activities between August 1945 and January 1946 is notably sparse. The National Archives of the Philippines catalog lists 127 boxes of records for 1944 and 143 boxes for 1946, but only 31 boxes for 1945. Archivist reports from 1953 note that wartime disruption prevented proper record keeping. However, correspondence discovered in Douglas MacArthur's personal papers references multiple meetings with Philippine Commonwealth officials regarding Reconstruction contract allocations during this period. Several officials who attended these meetings resigned suddenly in early 1946, including Treasury Undersecretary Ramon Diokno and Commerce Secretary Jaime Hernandez. No official explanation for their departures appears in government records. Washington, D.C., April 1893, the Interstate Commerce Commission's investigation into preferential railroad shipping rates ended abruptly in April 1893 when Chief Investigator Charles McClure resigned, citing family health concerns. McClure's personnel file contains no medical documentation, and he immediately took a position with the New York Central Railroad as a regulatory consultant at 3 times his government salary. The resignation came 2 weeks after McClure had subpoenaed internal documents from several major railroads. Those subpoenas were subsequently withdrawn by McClure's successor, who determined the investigation lacked sufficient evidence to proceed. IC meeting minutes from this period, spanning March 15 to April 30, 1893, are marked missing in the National Archives Index, with a notation indicating they were not transferred from original storage. Washington, D.C., June 1978, the Senate Ethics Committee initiated an inquiry into potential conflicts of interest involving senators with financial holdings in defense contractors. The inquiry, announced in March 1978, was scheduled to issue preliminary findings in June. Instead, Committee Chairman Adlai Stevenson III announced the inquiry would be postponed pending procedural refinement. No further action was taken. 2 months later, Committee Counsel John Vardaman resigned to enter private practice. Stevenson's own papers, donated to the Illinois State Archives, contain almost no correspondence related to this inquiry, though his files for other investigations from the same period are comprehensive. Senate Ethics Committee records for May and June 1978 were later reported as damaged by water leak during a 1982 archive renovation. Jakarta, Indonesia. March 2002, Indonesia's Commission to Investigate the Wealth of State Officials began examining assets held by several cabinet ministers in President Megawati Sukarnoputri's government. The inquiry focused on properties and holdings that appeared inconsistent with official salaries. In March 2002, KPKPN Chairman Antonius Sujata announced the commission would narrow its scope to focus resources on more recent cases. 3 ministers who had been subjects of the inquiry were no longer under investigation. Sujata resigned in May 2002 to accept a position at state-owned Bank Mandiri. His successor, Yusril Iza Mahindra, told reporters the commission would prioritize systemic reform over individual cases. KPPN's case files from the 2001-2002 period were later described in agency reports as incomplete due to procedural transitions. Boston, November 1923, Massachusetts Attorney General J. Weston Allen initiated an investigation into allegations that state highway contracts were being awarded to companies with political connections to the governor's office. Allen announced the investigation in September 1923, stating he would follow the evidence wherever it leads. In November, Allen abruptly resigned, citing a desire to return to private legal practice. His resignation letter, preserved in state archives, is one paragraph long and provides no specific reasons. Allen joined the law firm of Tyler and Reynolds within a month. The firm's clients included the Massachusetts Highway Construction Association. The investigation was not resumed by Allen's successor, who stated that insufficient documentation existed to proceed. The Attorney General's office files on the highway contract inquiry contain only 3 documents, totaling 7 pages. New York City, February 1894, the Lexo Committee, investigating New York Police Department corruption, heard testimony from dozens of witnesses about systematic bribery and protection payments. In February 1894, several key witnesses who had testified in preliminary sessions failed to appear for scheduled follow-up questioning. Committee records note that saloon keeper Timothy Walsh, who had testified about paying police for protection, had relocated to unknown address. Brothel operator Matilda Herman was listed as unavailable. Family emergency. 3 other witnesses were marked deferred at request of counsel. No rescheduled dates appear in committee records. Police Captain William Devery, whom multiple witnesses had implicated, was initially transferred, but was reinstated within 8 months. His departmental file for this period contains a gap from January 1894 to June 1894, with a note indicating records misfiled during office reorganization. Rome. October 1993, Italian magistrates investigating the Tangentopoli corruption scandal sought documents related to political party financing from the Bank of Italy's Oversight Division. In October 1993, Bank of Italy officials informed investigators that records from 1985-1989 for specific accounts were no longer available due to standard retention policy compliance. This notification came despite Italy's banking regulations requiring 10-year retention of such records. Several Bank of Italy officials, with knowledge of party financing arrangements, transferred to private banking positions between September and December 1993. Magistrate Antonio Di Pietro later told journalists that witnesses had referenced specific meetings and transactions that apparently generated no documentation. Treasury Ministry files that might have contained related information were described in court documents as archived in facilities damaged during renovations. Washington, D.C., December 1955, the House Committee on Government Operations, investigating procurement irregularities at the Department of Defense, sought testimony from civilian contract officers who had raised concerns about competitive bidding procedures. In December 1955, Committee Chairman William Dawson announced that 4 key contract officers had accepted early retirement and were no longer available for testimony. Defense Department personnel records for these individuals contain standard retirement paperwork, but no indication of their previous cooperation with congressional investigators. The committee's final report, issued in March 1956, noted that absence of certain testimony limited its findings, but concluded that existing procurement procedures were generally adequate. Meeting transcripts from the committee's executive sessions during this investigation were classified and remained so for 50 years, released only in 2005. Washington, D.C., September 1955, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations held hearings on conflict of interest allegations against several regulatory officials. Witnesses provided detailed testimony about officials maintaining financial ties to industries they regulated. The hearings resulted in no criminal referrals. Instead, the committee recommended administrative reforms and enhanced disclosure procedures. Senator John McClellan, the subcommittee chairman, praised witnesses for their civic courage and noted that appropriate administrative measures will ensure this cannot recur. No officials lost their positions. The Bureau of the Budget subsequently issued a memorandum clarifying that officials could maintain passive investments in regulated industries if disclosed annually. This disclosure requirement created no enforcement mechanism and no penalties for non-disclosure. In congressional testimony the following year, several of the same officials who had been questioned still held their positions and confirmed they still held investments in regulated industries, now listed on disclosure forms filed with their own agencies. New York City, October 1881. Following the conviction of Boss Tweed, New York City implemented a new charter designed to prevent Tammany Hall-style corruption. The charter included provisions for competitive bidding on city contracts and oversight boards for expenditures. Within 2 years, city comptroller reports showed that 73% of contracts were still awarded to companies with Tammany connections. The charter's oversight requirements included an exception for emergency procurements, a category that grew to include routine purchases. The Board of Estimate, created to review large expenditures, consisted of elected officials who were themselves products of the Tammany system. In 1884, charter reform advocate Theodore Roosevelt testified before a state assembly committee that the new system had formalized rather than eliminated corrupt practices. The board's meeting minutes from this period show routine approval of sole source contracts justified by urgent operational needs for items including office furniture, routine maintenance, and seasonal supplies. Rome, March 1999. Following the Tangentopoli investigations that had implicated hundreds of politicians and business leaders in the 1990s, Italy enacted comprehensive anti-corruption legislation. The new laws included mandatory disclosure requirements, stricter procurement rules, and enhanced oversight mechanisms. A 2003 analysis by Transparency International found that corruption perception indices for Italy had not improved significantly since the reforms. Researchers noted that the legislation contained numerous exemptions for economic development initiatives and strategic national projects. Procurement rules included flexibility provisions for contracts deemed important to regional competitiveness. The anti-corruption agency created by the reforms had authority to investigate but not to prosecute, and its findings required referral to prosecutors who faced no mandatory timelines for action. By 2005, several politicians who had faced charges during Tangentopoli had returned to office, their cases having resulted in settlements, administrative penalties, or prosecutions that exceeded statutes of limitations. Chicago, July 1927. After extensive newspaper coverage of bootlegging operations with apparent police protection, Chicago Mayor William Thompson announced formation of a special moral squad to combat organized crime. The squad consisted of 50 officers selected by Thompson and reported directly to him rather than through the police department's normal chain of command. The Chicago Tribune analyzed the squad's arrest records for its first 6 months and found that while bootlegging arrests increased 34%, prosecutions decreased 28%. The majority of those arrested were released within 48 hours. Tribune reporters documented that several speakeasies raided by the Moral Squad reopened within a week at the same locations. The squad's existence allowed Thompson to cite aggressive enforcement in public statements, while the Tribune noted that the practical effect has been to regularize rather than suppress the liquor trade. Police department records show the Moral Squad received a budget allocation 40% higher than regular detective units, but generated fewer felony prosecutions than any comparable unit. Manila, Philippines, November 1986. Following the People Power Revolution that ousted Ferdinand Marcos, incoming President Corazon Aquino established the Presidential Commission on Good Government to recover ill-gotten wealth and reform corrupt institutions. The PEG identified billions of dollars in assets for recovery and began criminal proceedings against former officials. By 2000, according to academic analyses by University of the Philippines researchers, The PCG had recovered less than 10% of identified assets. The Commission's work was hampered by what legal scholars described as procedural complexity, including requirements that cases be filed in multiple jurisdictions and that asset seizures meet standards of proof higher than those for criminal conviction. Several high-profile cases were settled for fractions of claimed amounts. Meanwhile, officials from the Marcos era maintained political influence. Some held elected office under subsequent administrations. The PG itself became subject to controversy when commissioners were accused of mismanaging recovered assets. The institution created to combat corruption required its own oversight mechanisms. London, June 1889 Parliament passed the Local Government Act of 1888, which included provisions designed to reduce corruption in municipal contracts following scandals in several industrial cities. The act required public notice of contract opportunities and mandated that councils document their procurement decisions. A parliamentary review in 1895 examined implementation of these provisions. The review found that while technical compliance was common, councils had developed extensive use of professional consultants who advised on contract awards. These consultants frequently had financial relationships with bidding companies. The review documented that in Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool, between 60–75% of major contracts went to companies that employed the consultants who had advised councils on those same contracts. The review characterized this as a practice which, while not explicitly forbidden by the Act, undermines its remedial purpose. No amendments to address this practice were enacted. Council meeting records from this period show routine acceptance of consultant recommendations without documented independent evaluation. Washington, D.C., August 2008. Following the financial crisis, Congress passed the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, which included oversight provisions for the Troubled Asset Relief Program. The legislation created the Office of the Special Inspector General for TARP and required regular public reporting. SIGTARP's reports documented numerous cases of what investigators termed structural conflicts, situations where firms receiving TARP funds had relationships with officials overseeing distribution. Treasury Department policies allowed firms to receive funds while their former executives served in key Treasury positions, provided these individuals recused themselves from direct decisions involving their former employers. SIGTARP reports noted that in practice, such recusals were difficult to enforce in an environment of fluid policy development. A 2012 SIGTARP audit found that the largest TARP recipients had received approvals through processes that involved multiple officials with former employment relationships to those firms, though no individual official's involvement rose to the level requiring formal recusal. The oversight structure had created transparency about these relationships without creating mechanisms to prevent them. Boston, April 1894, Massachusetts, enacted civil service reform legislation intended to eliminate patronage in state employment. The law required competitive examinations for most positions and created a civil service commission to oversee implementation. An 1898 commission report showed that the number of provisional appointments, positions filled without examination during emergencies, had increased each year since the law's passage. These provisional appointments, which could last up to 1 year with renewals, accounted for 23% of filled positions that were nominally subject to civil service rules. The Commission's own analysis noted that the provisional appointment mechanism, intended as a narrow exception, has become a routine alternative pathway. Commission records show that provisional appointees had a 71% rate of eventual conversion to permanent status, compared to a 34% success rate for candidates who took competitive examinations. The law had created the appearance of merit-based hiring while preserving substantial discretion in actual hiring decisions. The first crack appeared in 1973, when a low-level clerk named Marion Hodges discovered a filing error in the municipal archives. What seemed like a simple misfiled deed, a property transaction from 1889, contained signatures that shouldn't have existed. 3 council members, who according to official records, had resigned before the document's date, Hodges reported it to her supervisor, who quietly reassigned her to a different department. But Hodges 58 had already made copies. By 1905, the pattern was undeniable to those willing to see it. Journalist Arthur Pemberton published a series of articles in the Daily Chronicle tracing inconsistencies in land transfers spanning 40 years. Properties condemned for public use somehow ended up in private hands. Pemberton's printing press mysteriously caught fire 3 days after his 5th article ran. The insurance investigation was never completed. The modern unraveling began in 1989, when graduate student Lisa Chin chose an innocuous topic for her thesis: municipal land use patterns in mid-century development. Her research assistant scanned thousands of archived documents for digitization. The computer flagged 147 anomalies: deed transfers where the grantor had died before the signing date, rezoning approvals issued before applications were filed, demolition permits predating the buildings themselves. Chin's thesis advisor suggested she choose a different topic. She refused. In 1933, banker Edward Moss had noticed something peculiar in the loan documents for the Riverside Development Project. The collateral properties had been assessed at values triple their market rate, assessments signed by a city appraiser who'd been on medical leave during the supposed inspection dates. Moss prepared a confidential memo for the bank's board of directors. It was never discussed at any board meeting. Moss died of a heart attack 6 weeks later, at age 42. Each exposure followed the same trajectory: discovery, documentation, dismissal. The pattern itself was the evidence, recurring across decades, threading through generations, always deflected by coincidence or catastrophe. When Marion Hodges tried to present her findings to the city council in 1974, the meeting was disrupted by a bomb threat. When Arthur Pemberton's widow attempted to publish his remaining articles in 1906, she found every printer in 3 counties suddenly unwilling to take the job. When Lisa Chin submitted her thesis in 1990, the only surviving copy was the one she'd mailed to her mother in Taiwan. The university's digital archives suffered what it called catastrophic corruption. The documents surfaced anyway, they always did. But by the time they emerged, decades later, in different contexts, handled by people who didn't know the full story, their explosive power had been diffused by time and fragmentation. The 1994 hearing was supposed to be routine, a zoning variance for a commercial development on Maple Street. Former Planning Commissioner Gerald Vance attended, though he'd retired 5 years earlier. When the current commissioner began reading the environmental impact assessment, Vance stood up from the public seating area. "That's the same assessment," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber, "that we used for the Oakwood project." In 1978, word for word, the hearing was adjourned. Vance died of a stroke that night. The variance was approved 3 weeks later. In 1879, the trial of Mayor Harrison Webb drew national attention. Webb stood accused of fraud, conspiracy, and extortion, charges stemming from the revelation that 18 city contracts had been awarded to companies that existed only on paper. The prosecution presented 47 witnesses and hundreds of pages of documentation. Webb's defense attorney called just one witness: Webb himself. His testimony lasted 14 minutes. "I signed what I was told to sign," he said. "I approved what I was told to approve. I don't know who told me. I never saw their faces." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Webb was acquitted on all counts. He served out his term and retired to a country estate no one could explain how he'd afforded. The 1962 civil suit brought by the Riverside Neighborhood Association seemed at first like it might succeed. 23 families sought compensation for properties taken through eminent domain, then sold to private developers rather than used for the promised public park. The association's lawyer, Thomas Brennan, had testimony from former city employees, financial records showing the money trail, photographs of the private offices built where swings and benches should have been. On the trial's 7th day, Brennan didn't appear in court. His paralegal received a telegram: "Wife ill. Must withdraw. Apologize to clients." Brennan's wife was perfectly healthy. he never practiced law again. The 2010 state investigation into corruption in municipal government spent 18 months building its case. Prosecutors interviewed hundreds of witnesses, subpoenaed decades of records, traced shell companies through 5 states. The grand jury heard testimony from 3 city officials who agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. What they described was a system so pervasive, so embedded, that it had become indistinguishable from normal procedure. The first cooperating witness, Rachel Kim, detailed how approval processes worked. You'd receive an application that had already been approved. Your job was to backdate your signature and initial the forms. She described finding stacks of pre-signed documents in her desk drawer her first day on the job. The second witness, James Hartford, explained the financial mechanisms, numbered accounts, layered transfers, properties that changed hands a dozen times in a single afternoon before settling with their intended owner. The third witness never testified. Harold Chin was found in his car in a closed garage, engine running, on the morning he was scheduled to appear. The investigation concluded with 8 indictments. 5 resulted in plea bargains, substantial fines, no jail time, agreements not to hold public office. 2 went to trial and ended in hung juries. The 8th defendant, Councilmember Patricia Valdez, represented herself. I was told it was how things worked, she testified. I was shown files from 1952, from 1978, from 1989. All the same procedures, all the same forms. Who was I to question 80 years of precedent? She was convicted of conspiracy and served 14 months in a minimum security facility. Upon release, she found employment at a consulting firm that advised municipalities on development projects. Her salary was 3 times what she'd earned in public service. Between the testimonies, patterns emerged. Every witness described the same sense of inevitability. Not coercion exactly, but a deep structural pressure that made resistance seem not just difficult, but absurd. They'd been given precedents, shown how things had always been done, made to understand that questioning the system was questioning reality itself. The trials collapsed, not from lack of evidence, but from an excess of it. The systems they revealed were too large, too entrenched, too interwoven with legitimate governance to excise without destroying the entire structure. Prosecutors who started by targeting individuals found themselves describing institutions. Judges who began by considering criminal acts found themselves confronting civic machinery. The law was designed to address aberrations. What it couldn't address was when the aberration had become the norm. The 1986 decision by the State Banking Commission to audit Merchants Trust came about not through suspicion, but accident. A computer error flagged the bank's reserves as non-compliant. A glitch, the bank's representatives assured everyone. But protocol required verification. The auditors found something peculiar. Accounts that existed in the ledgers but not in the filing cabinets. Deposits recorded but never traced to depositors. Withdrawal authorizations from people who claimed they'd never made. The head auditor, Susan Martinez, prepared a preliminary report noting irregularities requiring further investigation. That investigation never happened. The state banking commissioner announced his retirement 2 weeks later. His replacement declared the computer error adequately explained and closed the inquiry. Martinez was reassigned to consumer complaints, but Martinez had shown her preliminary findings to her sister, who mentioned them to her husband, who taught economics at the state university, who discussed them hypothetically. He insisted later with his graduate students. One of those students had an uncle in the FBI. The federal investigation took 3 years and produced a 600-page report that carefully avoided drawing conclusions. It documented transactions, traced money, mapped connections, but stopped short of interpretation. Whether these patterns represent intentional coordination or emergent coincidence, the report concluded, cannot be determined from the available evidence. Merchants Trust was fined $2.3 million for inadequate record-keeping procedures. No individuals were charged. The 1897 silence was more eloquent than any testimony. When District Attorney Morgan Fletcher announced he would not seek charges against anyone connected to the railway station land scandal, He offered no explanation. Reporters crowded his office. The mayor demanded a statement. Citizens organized a protest that filled the courthouse square. Fletcher said nothing. He simply stopped coming to work. His deputies found his letter of resignation on his desk, effective immediately, with no forwarding address. Fletcher reappeared 6 months later in San Francisco, working for a railroad company as a land acquisition specialist. When tracked down by a persistent journalist, he would say only, "I looked at what it would cost to pursue justice, not in money, in what would be destroyed in the pursuit. I decided the price was too high." He refused to elaborate. The 1952 Zoning Board revolt lasted exactly 1 meeting. 5 new members, all reform candidates elected on anti-corruption platforms, attended their first session determined to scrutinize every variance, every permit, every exception. Chairman Robert Walsh opened with a proposal to review all approvals from the previous 12 months. The board's secretary, Helen Porter, who'd held the position for 17 years, quietly placed a folder in front of each new member. "Background materials," she said. The folders contained newspaper clippings, bankruptcy notices, court records. Each new member found documentation of their predecessors, the reformers who'd tried before, what had happened to their careers, their families, their finances. Porter said nothing else. The meeting proceeded normally. Walsh's motion to review past approvals was never introduced. 3 of the 5 reform candidates resigned within the year, citing personal reasons. The other 2 served out their terms, voting consistently with the establishment majority. By 2004, the chain reactions had become visible enough that a network journalist named Catherine Wells decided to map them. She created a database. Every investigation, every resignation, every accident, every convenient memory lapse. She tracked the patterns across 127 years. Her software identified 89 distinct incidents that shared common elements. Documents disappeared, witnesses recanted, investigators redirected, prosecutors declined. She produced a documentary that was scheduled to air on a Tuesday evening in March. On Monday afternoon, the network's legal department raised concerns. The documentary made claims that, while technically sourced, could be considered defamatory. Wells was asked to make revisions. She refused. The network standards department then noted factual inconsistencies, dates that couldn't be verified, attributions that seemed questionable. Wells provided her sources. The standards review took 6 weeks. When it concluded, the documentary was approved to air. But by then the scheduled time slot had been filled with other programming. Wells was told it would run when time permits. It never did. Wells left journalism and became a professor of media studies, where she sometimes showed the documentary to her students as an example of how institutional pressure functions without explicit censorship. Each decision created ripples. Fletcher's silence in 1897 taught ambitious prosecutors that some cases weren't worth career suicide. The 1952 folders taught reformers that the system kept records of its victories. Martinez's reassignment in 1986 taught auditors where the boundaries were. Wells's documentary taught journalists that some stories, no matter how well documented, couldn't be told through conventional channels. The chain reactions weren't conspiracies. They were lessons, teaching themselves across generations. The system didn't need to issue orders. It simply needed to remember what happened to those who pushed too hard, and to make sure anyone who might consider pushing could access those memories. What remained unspoken was often louder than what was said. The gaps in testimony, the declined prosecutions, the convenient retirements, these silences accumulated, creating a negative space that described the shape of something too large to see directly. You could only perceive it by tracing what bent around it, what stopped when approaching it, what turned aside rather than confronting it. The unraveling was never complete because there was nothing discrete to unravel. Each thread pulled led to a dozen others. Each exposure revealed another layer. Each reaction created new patterns that would themselves need to be decoded by future investigators, who would face their own choices about how much truth was worth pursuing, and at what cost. The superintendent's statement was carefully worded. We are implementing new protocols to ensure student safety remains our highest priority. The phrase highest priority appeared 17 times in the document. Not mentioned, the security contractor who'd flagged concerns 3 months prior now suddenly retired. Not mentioned, the internal memo recommending budget cuts to counseling services, dated 2 weeks before. The families held press conferences. The media covered them. The protocols were announced. Everyone agreed. Never again. The security contractor started a consulting firm. Inspector Aberline was promoted 6 months after the Ripper murders ceased. His final report on the case ran to 43 pages, each one a masterclass in strategic omission. He described the victims in clinical detail. He outlined the investigative procedures. He noted the unprecedented public cooperation. He did not mention the physician whose name appeared in 3 separate witness statements. He did not mention the carriage seen near 2 crime scenes, bearing a crest his sergeant had recognized. He did not mention the meeting in the commissioner's office where certain evidence was deemed unreliable for prosecution. The case remained officially unsolved. The physician continued his Harley Street practice for another decade, treating members of parliament, respected until his natural death. His obituary praised his dedication to the advancement of medical science. Daniel Ellsberg went to trial. The charges: conspiracy, espionage, theft of government property. Maximum sentence, 115 years. But the trial never finished. Judge Byrne discovered that the White House plumbers had broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, that the FBI had wiretapped Ellsberg's phone without a warrant, that the government had attempted to bribe the judge himself with an FBI directorship. All charges dismissed. Ellsberg walked free. The Times won its case. Everyone agreed the system worked. What nobody mentioned, Ellsberg had given the papers to 17 different congressmen before going to the press. 17. Not one had acted. Not one had held hearings. Not one had done anything at all. The system didn't work until he broke it. And even then, Nixon resigned over Watergate, not the war. The war continued for 4 more years. Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize. The bombing of Cambodia was never prosecuted. The word genocide was never used in official capacity. The papers proved the lie. The lie changed nothing it was designed to hide. Albert Fall became the first U.S. cabinet member convicted of a felony committed while in office. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison and a $100,000 fine. Justice served. The oil executives who bribed him, Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny, were acquitted. Sinclair served 3 months for contempt of court, a separate charge. Doheny was found not guilty. The jury decided he hadn't actually bribed anyone, despite Fall being convicted of receiving the exact same bribes. You can be convicted of taking a bribe that was never given. Fall served 9 months in prison, then was released due to poor health. He died in poverty. Sinclair's oil company reported record profits the following year. Doheny continued operating his petroleum empire until his death, wealthy and respected. Both were buried with full honors. The scandal everyone remembers. The lesson nobody learned. The pattern is always the same. First, the revelation. Documents leak, victims speak, journalists investigate. The truth emerges like a body from deep water, bloated, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Second, the outrage. Public fury, righteous indignation demands for accountability. The system must respond. Heads will roll. Third, the sacrifice. Someone is offered up. Usually not the architect, they're too connected, too valuable, too systemic. Instead, the facilitator. The person who made it possible but didn't conceive it. The bagman. The fixer. The fall guy. Fourth, the theater. Trials, hearings, commissions. Designed to look like justice while protecting the machinery that created the crime. The performance of accountability. Fifth, the reward. The person sacrificed receives 9 months instead of 9 years. Early release. Health concerns. Time served. Sometimes they never see prison at all. Just fines paid from untraceable accounts. Disbarment reversed on appeal. Retirement with full pension. And finally, the silence. The public moves on. The outrage fades. The news cycle turns. The system remains. The Navy investigation took 2 years. 117 officers were eventually implicated in the sexual assault scandal. Flag officers, captains, commanders. The incident involved groping, assault, and what the report clinically termed the gauntlet, where junior female officers were physically forced through a hallway while being assaulted by dozens of men. Initial Navy investigation cleared everyone. Department of Defense investigation cleared everyone. Pentagon Inspector General investigation found the Navy's investigation severely flawed. Final tally after reinvestigation: 0 criminal convictions. Some administrative punishments. Some early retirements. Some reassignments. The Secretary of the Navy resigned. The admiral in charge of the initial investigation retired. 3 flag officers received letters of censure. And then, consequences. Real ones. Promotion systems were overhauled. Women's integration into combat roles accelerated. Training programs implemented. Cultural change initiatives. The scandal actually, genuinely, resulted in institutional reform. 30 years later, Navy recruitment of women has tripled. Women serve on submarines, in aviation, in special forces. Sexual assault reporting has increased, not because incidents increased, but because victims believe reporting might matter. The system changed, slowly, imperfectly, but measurably. Except the admiral who organized the initial cover-up died peacefully at age 92, with full honors, his rank and pension intact. His obituary in the Navy Times mentioned his distinguished career and his dedication to naval excellence. Tailhook was not mentioned. The officers who committed assault, most served out their careers. Some were reassigned. Some took early retirement with full benefits. Some went on to lucrative defense contracting jobs, where they still consult on Navy culture and readiness. The junior female officer whose assault complaint triggered the investigation, she left the Navy, wrote a book, dealt with decades of harassment from Navy loyalists who blamed her for destroying good men's careers. The culture changed. The architects remained. 602 people died, most of them women and children at a Christmas matinee. The theater had advertised itself as absolutely fireproof. It had no fire alarms, inadequate exits, locked emergency doors, and a stage curtain that was supposed to be fireproof but was actually painted canvas. The city was horrified. Arrests were made. The theater owners, the building inspector, the fire chief, the stage manager, the mayor who'd approved the occupancy permit, all charged. The trials dragged for years. Defense lawyers delayed, appealed, moved venues. Witnesses forgot details. Evidence disappeared. One by one, charges were dropped. Final convictions? 0. But the consequences? Massive. Chicago overhauled its fire code. Then Illinois. Then the entire country. Panic bars on emergency exits? That's from Iroquois. Exit signs that glow in the dark? Iroquois. Occupancy limits strictly enforced? Iroquois. Outward opening doors in public buildings? Iroquois. Every theater, every school, every public building in America is safer because 600 people burned to death in Chicago in 1903. The building codes worked. They're still working. Children are alive today because of regulations written in the aftermath of that fire. The owners? Rebuilt. One of them, Will J. Davis, went on to operate theaters across the Midwest for another 30 years. Died wealthy, respected, memorialized as a pioneer of American theater. The inspector who'd signed off on the unsafe building despite obvious violations? Fired, then rehired in a different department 6 months later. Retired with full pension. The architect who designed the death trap continued designing theaters. His other buildings still stand. Some are on historic registers. The laws changed. The lawbreakers prospered. Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey, a new FDA reviewer, refused to approve thalidomide for sale in the United States. The drug company pressured her. Her supervisors pressured her. She was called stubborn, difficult, obstructionist. She demanded more safety data. The company stalled. She demanded teratogenicity studies. The company provided inadequate research. She held firm. In Europe and Canada, where the drug had been approved, 10,000 children were born with severe birth defects. Phocomelia, limbs that didn't fully develop. Some babies born with flippers instead of arms. Some with no limbs at all. In the United States, because one bureaucrat refused to be pressured, 17 cases, all from clinical trials or samples obtained abroad. Kelsey became a national hero. JFK gave her an award. Her story entered medical school curricula. The FDA's drug approval process was completely reformed. The Kefauver-Harris Amendment required proof of efficacy and safety before approval, not after. 10,000 lives destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of lives saved. And the German pharmaceutical company that made thalidomide? Gernenthal. They paid settlements, small ones, fought them for decades. Never admitted liability. Never apologized, not officially, not until 2012, 50 years later, and then only under pressure. The executives who suppressed safety data never prosecuted, never imprisoned. Several went on to leadership positions in other pharmaceutical companies. The British distributor paid pittance settlements, declared bankruptcy to avoid further liability, then reformed under a new name. The long-term consequence? The system became more rigorous. The EFTA became the model for drug regulation worldwide. Countless dangerous drugs were kept off the market, but the human consequence? The thalidomide survivors lived with their disabilities. Many couldn't work. Many faced discrimination. Many died young from complications. The settlements they received, when they received any, amounted to a few $1,000s per person. The companies moved on. The victims didn't. The city, under state-appointed emergency management, switched its water source to save money. The Flint River water was corrosive. It leached lead from aging pipes into drinking water. Officials knew. Studies showed elevated lead levels. Residents complained the water was brown, smelled bad, caused rashes. State officials insisted it was safe. Dr. Mona Hanna Atisha, a pediatrician, conducted her own study. Lead levels in children's blood had spiked. She went public. State officials called her research unfortunate, said she was causing near hysteria, attempted to discredit her. She had tenure. She had data. She had community support. She persisted. Eventually, the state admitted the problem. The federal government intervened. The water source was switched back. The emergency was declared. Consequences. 15 officials were criminally charged, including the state health director and the state director of environmental quality. Charges ranged from misconduct to involuntary manslaughter. The city received federal aid, new pipes were installed, monitoring systems were enhanced. Real accountability, it seemed. But then, 8 years of legal battles. Charges dismissed. Charges refiled. Witnesses died. Evidence was deemed inadmissible. Appeals, motions, delays. By 2023, no one had served prison time. Most charges were dropped or pleaded down. The former governor, who'd overseen the emergency management system, pleaded no contest to misdemeanor willful neglect of duty. He was sentenced to a year of probation. His pension? Intact. His law license? Intact. His book deal? Signed. The long-term consequence for Flint? Infrastructure improved, but trust destroyed. Children with irreversible lead exposure? Effects that last lifetimes. Property values collapsed. Population declined. The scars remain. The long-term consequence for the system? Emergency management laws are still in place. Other cities still have lead pipes. The same cost-saving logic that poisoned Flint still drives municipal decisions across the country. The immediate crisis was resolved. The systemic crisis continues. This is the paradox of long-term consequences. Sometimes the system learns. Sometimes regulations improve. Sometimes institutions actually change. But the people who made the regulations necessary, they rarely pay the price the regulations exact from everyone else. New building codes save lives, except the lives already lost. New drug approval processes prevent disasters, except the disasters that prompted them. New oversight prevents corruption, except the corruption that funded the careers of those now comfortably retired. The long-term consequence is a better system built on unaccountable bones. The official narrative, written in real time by crisis communications consultants, Penn State's story is one of resilience. In the wake of the Jerry Sandusky scandal, the university community came together. Leadership changed. Policies were reformed. Athletic department oversight was enhanced. The institution emerged stronger, more committed than ever to its core values of integrity and student welfare. The Free Report identified failures. Those responsible were removed. Settlements were paid. The university cooperated fully with authorities. Penn State took responsibility. The actual facts? Joe Paterno knew since at least 1998. Graduate assistant Mike McQueary witnessed a rape in 2001 and reported it. Athletic director Tim Curley knew. Senior VP Gary Schultz knew. President Graham Spanier knew. They discussed it. They debated what to do. They decided not to report it to authorities. They decided not to ban Sandusky from campus. They decided to tell him to wear shorts in the shower. Sandusky raped at least 10 more boys over the next decade, many in Penn State facilities. The rewritten narrative, failures of judgment, inadequate protocols, an unfortunate situation that exposed systemic weaknesses now corrected. The uncomfortable truth, multiple powerful men chose to protect a football program's reputation instead of children being raped in their showers. Paterno died before prosecution. Curley, Schultz and Spanier were convicted. Curley and Schultz pleaded guilty to misdemeanor child endangerment, served 3 months and 2 months respectively. Spanier was convicted of the same, sentenced to 4 to 12 months, served 2 months in county jail. For enabling child rape through conscious inaction, 2 months in county jail. But the narrative that persists? Penn State learned from tragedy. The university now leads in child protection protocols. We honor the victims by ensuring it never happens again. We are Penn State. The alumni still chant it at games. The students still believe it. The narrative has been successfully rewritten. And Paterno? There's still debate about his statue. Some want it back. Some wear 409 shirts, his official win total before NCAA sanctions. Some insist he was unfairly scapegoated, that he reported what he knew, that he followed protocol. The narrative they prefer? Tragic hero. Imperfect but honorable, destroyed by a rush to judgment. The narrative that's true? He valued football wins more than raped children, and died wealthy, surrounded by people who loved him. Both narratives exist. One is more comfortable. Guess which one more people believe? The scandal that almost ended Grant's presidency. Federal officials, distillers, and distributors conspired to avoid taxes on whiskey. Millions in lost revenue. Evidence of corruption throughout Grant's administration. Grant's private secretary, Orville Babcock, was directly implicated. Grant himself was called to testify, the first sitting president ever deposed. Narrative rewrite, as it happened. First version, President Grant knew nothing of any misconduct and is shocked by these revelations. Evidence emerged of Grant's frequent correspondence with Babcock during the conspiracy. Second version, President Grant corresponded on many matters. Nothing in his letters indicates knowledge of illegal activity. More evidence emerged of Grant blocking earlier investigations. Third version, President Grant may have inadvertently hindered investigations, but only because he trusted his staff too completely. Final version, the whiskey ring scandal, while unfortunate, demonstrates Grant's fundamental honesty. He cooperated fully once informed and protected no one proven guilty. Babcock was acquitted. Grant testified as a character witness. Babcock was immediately rehired in a different federal position. Modern historical narrative: Grant's presidency was marred by corruption, though Grant himself was considered personally honest. Translation: everyone around him was corrupt. He protected them, promoted them, testified for them. But we've decided to believe he didn't know. The narrative protects the presidency. The presidency protects the men. The men rewrite the narrative. Circle complete. The official story: North Vietnamese boats attacked the US Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin on August 2, 1964. A second attack occurred on August 4. President Johnson had no choice but to respond. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing military force. The Vietnam War escalated to protect American lives and interests. The actual events: August 2nd, the Maddox was supporting South Vietnamese raids on North Vietnamese islands. When North Vietnamese patrol boats approached, Maddox fired warning shots. The patrol boats returned fire. The Maddox was not damaged. This was not an unprovoked attack, it was a response to American military operations in North Vietnamese waters. August 4th, no attack occurred. The Maddox reported torpedo sounds and radar contacts during a storm. Later analysis determined they were false readings. The ship's captain, James Stockdale, flying overhead, reported no enemy boats. Commander John Herrick on the Maddox cabled Washington. Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Suggests complete evaluation before any further action taken. Johnson received this cable. He ordered retaliatory airstrikes anyway. He went on national television to announce the second attack. He never mentioned the doubt. He never mentioned the false radar. He never mentioned that his own commanders weren't sure it happened. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution passed the House 4160 and the Senate 88-2. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara testified there was unequivocal proof of the second attack. 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. The narrative rewrite began in 1971 when the Pentagon Papers revealed doubts about the second attack. But the full narrative didn't shift until 2005, when NSA documents declassified showed definitive proof no second attack occurred. By then, McNamara had published his memoir. His narrative: we were wrong, terribly wrong about Vietnam. But we acted in good faith with the information available. Information that included cables saying the attack didn't happen. Information he had when he testified under oath that it definitely did. The current historical narrative, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, demonstrates how incomplete intelligence and Cold War paranoia led to tragic escalation. Not. Leaders manufactured a pretext for war they'd already decided to fight. Not. They lied to Congress and the American people to justify killing millions. The passive voice does heavy work. Intelligence was incomplete instead of McNamara lied. Escalation occurred instead of Johnson chose war based on an attack he knew probably didn't happen. McNamara died in 2009, age 93, surrounded by family. His obituary called him one of the most influential defense secretaries in American history, and noted he later expressed regret about the war. Regret, not responsibility, not accountability, regret. The narrative protects the architect. The deaths become tragedy. The lies become incomplete information. Passive voice as absolution. The immediate narrative, written by German authorities. Spontaneous public outrage following the assassination of German diplomat Ernst von Rath by a Polish Jew led to unfortunate incidents across Germany. Some property damage occurred. Authorities worked to restore order. The actual events. Nazi leadership planned and coordinated a nationwide pogrom. Goebbels gave the order. SS and SA members in civilian clothes attacked Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues. 267 synagogues destroyed. 7,500 Jewish businesses destroyed. 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps. At least 91 Jews murdered, likely many more. The glass from shattered windows, from Jewish-owned shops, from synagogues, from homes, covered the streets. Kristallnacht. The Night of Broken Glass. The Nazi narrative. Regrettable but understandable reaction to Jewish provocation. The international narrative at the time, concerning developments in Germany, requiring diplomatic response. The narrative after the war, an early sign of the Holocaust to come, which the world failed to heed. But there's another rewritten narrative, quieter, more insidious. The companies that insured those destroyed businesses, they paid out claims to the German government, which immediately confiscated the money and fined the Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmarks for the damage done to them. Those insurance companies were international. Allianz, for instance. They paid the Reich, collected premiums, maintained operations throughout the war. After the war, business as usual. No prosecutions. Some settlements in the 1990s after lawsuits. Small ones. Allianz is now one of the world's largest insurance companies. Their corporate history page mentions difficult periods during the National Socialist era and notes the company's commitment to working through its historical responsibility. Working through. Present tense. Ongoing process. Never quite complete. The narrative, we're addressing this, learning from it, committed to historical transparency. The reality, profited from genocide, paid tiny settlements 50 years later, now market themselves as ethically responsible corporate citizens. Kristallnacht is remembered. The companies that ensured the destruction are still collecting premiums. The narrative has been rewritten to make memory compatible with profit. There's a formula now. Crisis communications firms sell it as a service. Phase 1. Immediate response days 1-3. Express concern. Promise investigation. Avoid specifics. Emphasize commitment to values. Phase 2. Investigation weeks 1-8. Hire external investigators who you're paying. Cooperate fully with. Investigation you control. Implement immediate changes mostly lying. Regular updates, nothing new. Phase 3. Report months 2-6. Release findings carefully. Accept recommendations. Announce reforms existing program. Move leadership lateral moves. Soft landings. Phase 4. Rebuilding months 6-24. Launch new initiatives. Host listening sessions. Update policies. Rebrand, if necessary. Phase 5. Integration, years 2+. Frame crisis as growth opportunity. Emphasize lessons learned. Highlight improvements made. Resume normal operations. Phase 6. Legacy, years 5+. Crisis becomes case study. Leaders become speakers. Victims become statistics. Truth becomes narrative. It works. Every time. Because we let it. Because we move on. Because the news cycle turns. Because we're tired. Because we want to believe people learned. Because we need to believe institutions can change. Because the alternative, that they won't, that they don't, that they're designed not to, is too exhausting to accept. The narratives have been rewritten. Penn State is resilient. Grant was misunderstood. Vietnam was complicated. Kristallnacht was a warning we heeded. The news stories are cleaner than the truth. More hopeful. More manageable. More false. But false narratives are easier to live with than true ones. So we accept the rewrites. We teach them to our children. We move forward into the same structures that necessitated the rewrite in the first place. You know that when they say mistakes were made, they mean Choices were made, and we're not telling you who made them. It's not an accident. It's design. The sentence removes the actor, the motive, and the consequence, and leaves you with something that sounds like truth but costs nothing to say. You know that when they say lessons were learned, they mean we learned how to manage the PR better next time. You know that when they say reforms were implemented, they mean we created new policies we have no intention of enforcing. You know. And knowing doesn't change anything, but it makes you complicit in a different way. Before, you didn't know the pattern. You believed in accountability. You thought the system worked. Eventually, imperfectly. Now you know it doesn't. Not for everyone. Not really. Now you know the machine runs on the ground-up bones of people who trusted institutions to protect them. Now you know that every promise of never again is made by the same structures that enabled this time. Now you know someone will be sacrificed. Not the architect, never the architect, but someone close enough to satisfy. Someone whose sacrifice protects the structure that created the conditions that made the scandal inevitable. There will be reforms. They will be announced with fanfare. They will be implemented with less enthusiasm. They will be quietly defunded within 5 years. By the time anyone notices, the crisis will be old news. There will be settlements. NDAs will be signed. Victims will be compensated for their silence. The amount will be large enough to make headlines, small enough to preserve profit margins. Accountability will be measured in dollars, not consequences. The news cycle will move on. And in 10 years, someone will write about how the institution emerged stronger from its dark chapter, how it learned important lessons, how it honors the victims by ensuring it never happens again. The investigation ended without conclusion. The official returned to private practice, the firm took the contracts, and the records stayed clean enough to pass inspection. No charges. No outrage. Just continuity until it does. The same alarms sound, the same assurances follow, the same committees convene. Statements are drafted, timelines adjusted, responsibility diluted. The cycle repeats with new names and familiar outcomes, until memory thins and attention wanders. What changes is not the machine, only the date on the document, the language in the apology, and the lesson promised, again, for next time, because the machine is still running. Same gears, same mechanisms, same incentives, just new PR. You could get angry, you could organize, you could demand real accountability, or you could scroll past. One more headline in an infinite feed, one more scandal in an endless queue, one more promise of change that changes nothing. You keep scrolling. Not because you don't care, but because caring didn't work the last time, or the time before that, or the time before that. The machine is too big, the patterns too entrenched, the narratives too well protected. Individual outrage evaporates, collective memory fades, the institutions remain. But you know now, you know the script, you recognize the performance. You can see the narrative being written in real time. 4 officers raised concerns. They accepted early retirement, became unavailable for testimony, and disappeared from the record. The committee declared procedures generally adequate. The system remained untouched. Grant's reputation underwent interesting evolution. Immediate, scandal-plagued president. Early 20th century, failed president. Personally honest but politically naive. Late 20th century, underrated president whose failures were overstated. 21st century, misunderstood president deserving rehabilitation. Champion of Reconstruction. Each generation rewrites him. Each finds what it needs. The whiskey ring gets smaller in each version. The men he protected fade. The revenue they stole becomes alleged corruption. The evidence becomes claims of impropriety. The latest Grant biography, published 2020, 900 pages. Whiskey Ring gets 11 pages. Spends more time on Grant's drinking habits than his protection of tax thieves. The narrative protects legacy. Legacy protects narrative. The men who stole millions are unnamed. Grant gets a redemption arc. There's now a museum in Vietnam. The War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City. American tourists visit. They see photos of napalm burns, Agent Orange victims, My Lai massacre evidence. They see the American narrative confronted with Vietnamese reality. Most leave shaken. Some leave angry. At the museum for propaganda. Some leave changed. There are museums now. Memorials. Education programs. Germany has done more than most nations to confront its past. The memorials are stark, unflinching. The education is comprehensive. But the companies that profited, most still exist. Volkswagen, built by slave labor, still exists. Deutsche Bank, financed the camps, still exists. Bayer, did experiments on prisoners, still exists. Allianz, ensured the genocide, still exists. All have issued statements. All have paid settlements. All have created educational programs. All have confronted their history. All are also massively profitable corporations that use Nazi collaboration as their foundation for post-war growth. The narrative? These companies have reckoned with their past and transformed into ethical modern corporations. The reality? They kept the wealth. They kept the infrastructure. They kept the market dominance. They paid a tiny fraction back and called it reckoning. But the real narrative rewrite isn't corporate. It's temporal. Nazi Germany has become historical abstraction. The Holocaust is taught as unique evil, unprecedented, hopefully never repeated. This narrative is comforting. It's also false. The Holocaust was industrial genocide. But genocide isn't unique. The concentration of corporate power isn't unique. The collaboration of bureaucrats isn't unique. The systematic dehumanization isn't unique. What's unique is that we've convinced ourselves it was unique, that it couldn't happen again. Not like that. Not here, not now. The narrative rewrite. This was exceptional aberration, not logical extension. The uncomfortable truth, the mechanisms that made it possible, exist in every modern state. The corporations that profited still exist. The bureaucratic structures that enabled it still exist. We've rewritten the narrative to make it history instead of warning. And now you know why narratives get rewritten. Not because truth is relative. Not because everyone has their own truth. Not because objective reality doesn't exist. Narratives get rewritten because the truth is expensive. Expensive to acknowledge. Expensive to address. Expensive to repair. Cheaper to rewrite. Cheaper to call it mistakes were made than murder. Cheaper to call it errors in judgment than conspiracy. Cheaper to call it tragic escalation than war crime. Cheaper to call it institutional failure than institutional choice. The passive voice costs nothing. Active voice costs everything. There's a scholarship fund now. The Sandusky Scandal Victims Fund. Penn State contributed. The NCA contributed. Donors contributed. Good things came from horror. Children are safer. Protocols are stronger. Awareness is higher. But ask yourself, who writes about Penn State now? Sports journalists writing about football's resilience. Business professors teaching crisis management. Public relations experts analyzing reputation recovery. Penn State has become a case study in successful institutional response to scandal. The children Sandusky raped? They're not the story anymore. They're the footnote that explains why the real story, successful crisis management, was necessary. The narrative has been rewritten. From institution that enabled child rape to institution that overcame adversity, and it worked. Applications are up. Donations are up. The football stadium still fills. The rewrite is complete. But in American textbooks, the narrative is tidier. The Vietnam War was a complex conflict influenced by Cold War politics. The Gulf of Tonkin incident led to American escalation. The war's outcome demonstrated the limits of American military power. Passive. Clean. No one did anything. Things just happened. Not. American leaders lied to justify a war that killed millions for no strategic gain. That narrative doesn't make it into standard textbooks. McNamara's later books are taught in political science courses as examples of reflective leadership. His admission of error is held up as intellectual honesty. The narrative, even the best and brightest can be wrong. We should learn from their humility. Not, he knew it was wrong while doing it and did it anyway. The rewrite turns war criminals into tragic figures who learned important lessons too late. Lessons they teach from comfortable retirement, well compensated, never prosecuted. This is the final sleight of hand, the narrative rewrite. It happens slowly, in stages. Stage 1, denial it didn't happen. The reports are exaggerated. These are isolated incidents being sensationalized. Stage 2, minimization it happened, but not as badly as claimed. The scope has been overstated. Context is being ignored. Stage 3, rationalization it happened, but there were reasons. Decisions were made with limited information. The standards of the time were different. Stage 4, deflection it happened, but others were worse. This was regrettable, but consider the alternative. Compared to what could have happened. Stage 5, abstraction mistakes were made. Errors in judgment occurred. The situation was complex. It was a different era. Stage 6, redemption. We've learned from this. It made us stronger. We honor the victims by ensuring it never happens again. This dark chapter ultimately led to important reforms. Stage 7, integration. The scandal becomes historical footnote. The perpetrators become complicated figures. The victims become symbols. The lesson becomes curriculum. The narrative is complete. The rewrite is successful. It's late. You're scrolling. Another headline about a scandal. Another investigation announced. Another official promises accountability. You recognize the script now. You've seen it before. The outrage. The investigation. The findings. The reforms. The moving forward. You know how it ends. You've read this story 13 times tonight in 13 different chapters spanning 13 different eras. The details change. The pattern doesn't. The sun rises. You go to work. You pay your taxes. You vote. You trust that the water is clean, the buildings are safe, the doctors are competent, the officials are honest. You have to. The alternative is paralysis. You trust the machine even though you know how it works. Even though you've seen what it does. Even though you've read the receipts. Because what choice do you have? So you keep scrolling. Past the scandal. Past the outrage. Past the promises. Into the same world, with the same systems, grinding the same way, just slightly better at hiding it, just slightly better at rewriting it, just slightly better at making you complicit in your own acceptance. And somewhere, in a boardroom, someone is drafting a statement. We are committed to learning from this tragedy. And somewhere, in a courthouse, someone is negotiating a settlement. The terms must include non-disclosure, and somewhere, in a PR firm, someone is updating the crisis management playbook. Phase 6 should emphasize growth narrative, and somewhere, in a history department, someone is writing next year's textbook. The scandal ultimately led to important reforms. The machine keeps running. The narratives keep rewriting. The bones keep grinding. You put your phone down. You turn off the light. You close your eyes. And tomorrow, you'll wake up and trust the machine again. Because you have to. Because the alternative is unbearable. Because the lullaby is more comfortable than the truth. Hush now. The system is working. Mistakes were made, but lessons were learned. It's different now. It's better now. Go back to sleep. We've got this under control. Trust us. And you do. And now you know why.